So we're here to present our findings on the criteria for the evaluation of railway improvement plan projects so we can improve the high-speed rail system in America. So since we're talking about the Federal Rail Commission, we think it's very important to first start out with the main objective and the mission of the FRC. So here they have stated it's to ensure a safe, secure, and efficient railway system. And implicit in that objective is the fact that we want to grow ridership and increase the number of riders who are taking the high-speed rail system. So now that we have established the objective, we want to clearly state what is the problem that we're addressing. So our recommendations are addressing how to establish effective criteria for evaluating agency grant proposals to appropriate the $8 billion of funding that was given to create a high-speed passenger rail network. So basically, agencies are being given all this, the FRC was given all this money. Agencies want this money, so we want to figure out how to best distribute that money. So we made a couple of assumptions when coming up with our criteria. So first, the major metropolitan areas or states are the ones that are applying for the grants. Secondly, these are one-time, one-year grants with a reevaluation process for additional funding. So we came up with 4 main categories of the criteria that should be addressed when agencies come up with these proposals. The first is a transportation improvement plan. The second is sustainability. The third is community development. And the fourth is comparative advantage. And we'll go into more depth of each of those right now. Okay. So first, the transportation improvement plan. We can think of this as kind of the bare bones or the basics of the plan. Agencies need to clearly establish the need. Why should this city or state get funding if there isn't really a need? So we need a clear goal. If cities or agencies know where they want to go at the end, then we know that they have a clear goal in mind. Since we're talking about money here, funding allocation is super important. Creating a budget, including maintenance and operational costs, expected revenues, and other expected costs. We need a well thought out plan. Next, proof of matching funds. Since we were given this grant with the stipulation that the agencies need a matching grant, we need to ensure and see proof that they have these available funds. Anticipated challenges. This is super important. If we talk about the case of California, one anticipated challenge would be weather-related incidents, including earthquakes. And then if we talk about the East Coast, snow, for example, should be factored in. And then lastly, the timeline of the project. Is it realistic, given the anticipated challenges, to project their plan to happen within a year or 2 years? We want a realistic timeline.
Next, we're going to discuss sustainability, which builds off of the transportation improvement plan, but with more of a long-term focus. So we want to evaluate the proposals we receive based on short-term and long-term effects. In the short run, are they going to run a deficit with eventually breaking even or turning a profit in the long term? And if not, how are they going to address the long-term deficits? Because this is just one-time funding, we really want to make sure they have a vision for the entirety of the project as opposed to just the short term. So specifically, we want them to highlight anticipated revenue. Is the state setting aside additional funding to continue the program after the grant runs out? Or do they have a partnership with, say, a local business or a local company that is going to come in and say, we'll help you subsidize the ticket prices? Also, as the European counterparts showed, tourism is hugely impacted by the high-speed railway associations. So we want to know how that is going to affect their revenues and how they're planning to deal with the additional traffic. The operating budget, kind of building off of the transportation improvement plan, we want to see not only the budget for creating this railway system, but actually how they're going to fund it. How many personnel they anticipate needing, where the personnel are coming from, and what their costs are going to be in terms of running the service from one city to another. And lastly, we're going to look at job creation, specifically short-term employees versus permanent positions. In the construction process, there can be a lot of short-term job creation, and we want to make sure that not only are they hiring people for the short term, but also they're keeping in mind how many positions they're going to create for the local people in terms of running the trains on a daily basis. So operators of the train stations, engineers, and maintenance facilities. Next, we're going to talk about community development. A major concern for the FRC is the impacts of on the people in the community surrounding these high-speed railway areas. So specifically, we want to talk about public-private partnerships and the railway integration plan. In terms of public-private partnerships, we envision these proposals in creating these proposals, agencies will reach out to local businesses and see if there's an interest in sponsorship or how they can work with them to meet their needs. And the railway integration plan is specifically working with people who already own rail. As mentioned in our materials, a majority of the rail is currently privately owned in the United States, and it's important to not start from scratch with these projects. We want to work with the people who have experience in the railway industry to make sure that these plans are the most efficient. Traffic reduction is an issue that has come up through the European systems. They've experienced that people will prefer the high-speed railway over the highway, and so we really want to make sure they're focused on how this is going to impact highway traffic. Neighborhood development is something that has also been seen in Europe with the advent of these high-speed railway systems, in that the suburbs outside the cities suddenly become more accessible, and so they can spur development in those areas. And lastly, we want to talk about public support and education. It's really important that for these projects to succeed, the public in the areas affected understands what's going on and why this is going to be beneficial to them. So in presenting the plan, we really want to make sure that these agencies have a plan for public outreach. How are they going to involve the community members in building this project?
And next, we'd like to talk about comparative advantage. The two main competitors to highway passenger rail are air and highway travel. It's important to compare each travel option to effectively show that high-speed passenger rail can actually offer a superior alternative. One way through which to address this would be by analyzing cost effectiveness. We want agencies to assure us that high-speed passenger rail will actually be the cheaper alternative for these proposed routes. And to do so, they would actually have to address their ticket pricing strategies. For example, are there subsidies or other cost-reducing strategies in place that would ensure that these tickets would actually provide cheaper alternatives to riders than taking a flight or driving a vehicle? Also, we want to talk about the number of people impacted. High-speed passenger rail can accommodate more people per route than a vehicle or a plane can. As read in a New York Times article, high-speed passenger rail can actually accommodate up to 8 times as many people as a flight, and obviously it can accommodate more people than a vehicle. But agencies would actually have to show quantitative measures regarding the number of people who can actually be accommodated through each travel option. Also, we want to talk about fuel costs. Can agencies actually demonstrate that fuel costs would be less given ridership and vehicle type versus highway vehicle or air travel? Also, we want proposals to analyze environmental impacts. We want to ensure that organizations are using existing tracks versus eminent domain to minimize environmental impacts. Also, we want to ensure that feasibility studies are done to ensure that environmental health and safety impacts are less than air or highway travel. Also, we want travel time to be analyzed. Would high-speed rail actually offer a faster route than highway or air travel? And finally, we do want proposals to analyze safety. We do have data that shows that Japan and France have never had a fatality on high-speed train, but agencies would actually have to show information that can confidently support that high-speed rail offers a safer alternative to highway or air travel. And also, we wanted to talk about key stakeholders since they are extremely important in our evaluative criteria. Right now, they're listed in their order of importance. We listed Congress first because we wanted to ensure their buy-in regarding our strategy, because we want them to feel confident in the authority that they've provided through the $8 billion in funding. Next, we want to address the American public, because they're the people who actually be using the high-speed rail network. We want to ensure that they feel comfortable enough to use the system and provide the revenue that will help ensure sustainability. Next, we want to discuss environmental groups. We want them to also feel comfortable with the use of funds so that they will not go politically against us. And last, we want to focus on state and local governments since we want them to feel comfortable because they're the ones requesting the funding. And next, we want to discuss anticipated challenges in creating these proposals. We understand that there is issues regarding the resource ability to collect information for these proposals. We do have to consider that these proposals are being placed by agencies who do have constraints at the state and local level that will limit their ability to collect evaluated information. Next, we also want to focus on the collection of quantitative measures. It can be hard to collect accurate information on quantitative measures, including but not limited to comparative advantage. And that's why we focused our qualitative and quantitative measures on measures that can effectively capture the data necessary to analyze those elements. And finally, I want to discuss the accuracy of budget. There are incentives for agencies to overemphasize their sustainability and underpredict their time frame to help increase their chances of obtaining funding. And that's how come it's so important that we've addressed that using our transportation improvement plan, which we feel would ensure effective analysis and accuracy of information.
So we just kind of want to wrap up with an overall picture of how we developed our criteria. We built the criteria so that they build off of one another, with the transportation improvement plan and sustainability at the bottom, focusing on financial solvency of the program, and then eventually working to community development and comparative advantage. An ideal proposal under this system would include pieces of all four with an emphasis on physical solvency. And we believe this captures the needs of the organization because without the community buy-in and the advantage of the proposal, the sustainability and the budget proposal won't be solvent long-term. So we really feel that in having these steps, we'll find the best proposals, and that will make the buy-in of Congress and the American public maximized for each proposal. And with that, we would like to open it up to questions.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you. These are some great ideas you presented to us. One of our top priorities is job creation. And how would you, what are some of the specific quantitative measures that you would use to evaluate job creation as well as to ensure that the information that's being provided by the grantees is realistic and accurate?
So the answer to this question is twofold. In terms of job creation, we want to look at, as I mentioned with the sustainability, short-term and long-term. Mm-hmm. We recognize that there is going to be an initial influx of jobs. There's going to be construction workers and people building up the railway, but then there's also going to be the long-term positions in operating the trains from route to route. And so in that respect, we want them to work with the existing construction companies to provide an accurate form of how many people they're going to need, as well as predicting, based on other high-speed rail programs, how many people it's actually going to take to operate that. And in terms of this, of how we're going to evaluate how accurate their measures are, we're going to look to other programs. We have examples, not necessarily in the United States, that we can use as a baseline for similar programs.
Like, baseline for what?
So a baseline, there are high-speed rail programs in Europe. So we read about Spain and France as examples. So we see how they operate theirs, and so we can kind of use that as a baseline measure. But until we have programs in the United States, it's going to be very difficult to actually measure how accurate the predictions are.
I have a question. You touched on measuring data a lot in your presentation, which I loved. And you talked about how it's important to make sure they're accurate. How would you go about doing that, just out of curiosity? I mean, we're going to have a bunch of people that want part of our $8 billion, and they're going to be giving us proposals, and I want to make sure we can compare apples to apples.
So one of the things that we talked about is in the transportation improvement plan, since they will be outlining the need of the city. Based on that and giving a bigger picture, we can compare, because if there is no real need in the city or there's no desire for the train to be there, maybe thinking about sources of revenue. So if there's no need and there aren't sources of revenue coming in from the people actually riding the train, maybe the budget that they predicted or that they proposed wasn't necessarily accurate. So we're using the transportation improvement plan to give us a bigger picture to help us with that accuracy. Again, like Dana mentioned, since there is no real measure in the United States, it's definitely a challenge to get those accurate numbers, but we can use European railway systems as a guideline.
So as a follow-up, one of my concerns is that people might overinflate ridership numbers. They might say that, this high-speed rail is going to be better and more beneficial to the transportation improvement plan than it actually will end up being, to try and get the money and jobs in their part of the country. So how would you ensure that that didn't happen? Or would you just rely on their estimates that they provided?
I think think one way we could address that is if we did have the resources to actually go into that city or that state and maybe take a survey of, one idea we were talking about is since the two main options, competitive options, are air travel and highways, is maybe going to airports and asking people who are flying to a certain destination where the railway would be destined to go, if they would choose to take what the demand was. So that's one option. I realize that's a huge resource and labor-intensive project, but that was one idea that we had.
And another option as far as that is if it's a popular route already, looking at who's making that route now. Is it mostly business people? Is it mostly for pleasure? Or is this a completely new route? Because if we know how many people are traveling, let's say from Boston to Washington, D.C. on the current systems, that's going to give us an idea of a ballpark where the ridership numbers should be.
So your answer, just if I'm getting this right, is maybe looking at existing data, not relying on projections that they provide in their report, correct?
Well, it's comparing what they give us to the data we have as kind of
And just to point out, when we were talking with the commissioner, she did emphasize that one of the key areas would be the Northeast, where there is, for example, Boston to DC, where there already is a high number of riders who are traveling between the two cities.
It's a good segue. When you spoke with the commissioner yesterday, were there any other priorities that she mentioned as being pretty important to the project?
She really focused on capturing kind of existing popular routes and trying to get a baseline. So she talked a lot about the Northeast, as Vina just mentioned, getting a Boston to Washington route in, for example. That would also capture New York City to prove to the American people that this can be effective. So kind of having a case for us to look at instead of having to look to Europe.
Did she mention safety as a major?
She did. So while they want to get something working in the Northeast as soon as possible, what they don't want to do is have something forced through that could potentially negatively impact safety.
So on in your criteria, where does safety kind of come in?
It was under the comparative advantage and I think we compared it, Maryland, you compared it to the systems that they had, or in Japan and France.
And also in comparison to other modes of travel, how safe it would be compared to air or rail travel, highway travel.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. She also talked about, another thing she talked about was the priority of, while idealistically it would be the American public, that Congress is our main target here because they are giving us the funds. And so it is important to pick an area that is well-traveled. And there are fewer challenges in picking a place like that. So as Dana said, that's serving as a model.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.